Welcome back again, everyone. What I'd like to do is spend a few moments just reviewing, if you wish, because I've said this a lot already, reviewing the description of the data set or the study that gave us the data set that we're using in this class. I want to talk about the Framingham Heart Study. It's probably the most famous cohort study by epidemiologists, or at least one of the more famous studies of cohort studies in epidemiology. I remember going to a conference once of epidemiologists. That's a wild time when you get a bunch of epidemiologists in the same room. But a speaker gave a talk, and I don't remember what the talk was about. But I do remember when it was finished, there was a microphone in the middle aisle of the room, the large room we were in, and people were invited to go up and ask questions to the speaker about his or her presentation. And the moderator of the session said, when you go to the microphone, please identify yourself by name and give your affiliation. So people would be walking up there saying, hi, I'm so-and-so from the Harvard School of Public Health, or from one of the other great institutions in our country or around the world. But I remember distinctly another person walking up to the front of the room, identifying himself as saying, hi, I'm so-and-so, and I'm from the Heart Study. He didn't say the Framingham Heart Study. He said just the Heart Study. And everyone in the room knew what he was talking about. Everyone knew that he was from the Framingham Heart Study. That's how famous this study is among epidemiologists. We've been using data that is based on data collected from that heart study as data analyzed in the various analysis sections that we've been talking about in this class. But I want to give you some background now, again, about the Framingham Heart Study. And really what I want to give you is a resource of where to find information about the Framingham Heart Study. First of all, if you go on the web, you can find their webpage for the Framingham Heart Study. And it will contain history, contain results that they have. It's a great way to learn about the study, how it was developed, how it's operating, and things like that. So that's the first thing I'd recommend you to doing. The other thing is there's another site I'd refer you to, a video about the Framingham Heart Study. It essentially was created by one of the television networks here in the States, CBS. It runs for about 7 minutes long. It was part of a news show that they were showing. We were thinking of asking a film crew from our institution to go out there and do a video on the Framingham Heart Study. But the good news is there is one existing on the web. We don't have control over it. Hopefully it's still there now if you go try search for it. But do that. Go to it and you'll get a good feeling for how the Framingham Heart Study works. What are the steps involved in doing that study? A little bit of background, you'll learn from viewing those videos and viewing that website that the study was initiated in the late 1940s. So it's been around for almost 65 years. It was initially planned to last for 20 years. They enrolled 5,209 individuals. It took time to enroll those 5,000 individuals. It took them a few years to do that. The plan was to follow everybody for 20 years. But the study is still going on today. The survivors are still coming back and being evaluated for outcomes. They enrolled people between the ages of 30 and 60. They wanted to look at cardiovascular disease and the first development of cardiovascular disease as their primary outcome. So they wanted to enroll people who were at risk for developing the first case of cardiovascular disease. And they were first in another way. They were one of the first studies that enrolled women in an epidemiologic study. And essentially, roughly half the people in this study are men, and roughly half of the people in this study are women. The reason is that they try to get a typical representation of inhabitants of the town or the city of Framingham, Massachusetts. So they had volunteers recruit neighbors to be in this study. They figured if I got one person to be in the study, they might get their friends to be enrolled in this study. They essentially had people trying to recruit neighbors from every other house in their neighborhood to be in this study. Just so you have some background, in 1948, as today, Framingham is a typical city in the United States. It has typical characteristics. It has some characteristics that are more socioeconomically wealthier than others. There's a main road going through Framingham, Route 9 here. If you drove along Route 9 now today, you'd find shopping centers, restaurants, everything on that strip. Back in 1948, if you were south of the Route 9, it was mostly working class residents, while north of Route 9 were more professionals. They had a mixture of both. In 1948, there were a few minorities. Mostly everybody in Framingham in 1948 was Caucasian, was white. Well, over the years, Framingham has addressed that shortcoming by enrolling other cohorts from that area, cohorts that reflect the more diverse racial mix of the town of Framingham as it exists now. One of the reasons they chose Framingham is that Framingham had previously been used to study tuberculosis some 20 years later, and people were willing to be interviewed, people were willing to be enrolled into that previous tuberculosis study. The way the study works, the way it was designed, the way it still works today, is they have a central testing center where every 2 years participants are asked to come back to that testing center to have their risk factors updated and their outcomes reported. So they will ask people, since the last time we saw you, have you been diagnosed with a heart attack, a myocardial infarction? So they record self-reported outcomes from questionnaires that people are asked. They perform a large battery of medical tests to see if people's risk factors have changed, if they develop blood pressure, if their cholesterol levels have changed over the last time. They do a large battery of tests, and more tests are being added every year to address new hypotheses that they might have involved. And they do other testings like EKG, blood tests, and things like that. Any results they found are given to the patients and to their treating physicians. These testing centers are not designed to treat people. They're just designed to collect outcome and risk factor information. Any information that they obtain is given to the physicians who are actually caring for those individuals outside of this study. Well, I mentioned that over the years they have enrolled other cohorts out of the Framingham population. In 1971, they enrolled a cohort of roughly 5,000 people who were children or the spouses of children of the original Framingham cohort, the offspring study as it's referred to. And a third generation, a third cohort, was started in 2001, which were the offsprings of the offsprings, the third generations of the Framingham cohort study. So the Framingham cohort study gives us a large battery of information that we can use to answer risk factors and their development on certain outcomes. It's a classic example of an epidemiologic study, and we're very fortunate to be able to use data that was derived from the Framingham Heart Study in this particular class. Okay, the next time we come together, I want to make a few summary slides about about cohort studies in general, and then talk about a prelude for another cohort study that we'll be talking about in this class. So I'll see you next time.